Dr. Aniseh Bassiri Tabrizi, you are an expert on Iran, and we're going to talk about the protests that started last year and the state of the regime. What are you going to tell me?
I'm going to talk about the state of the demonstration, how weak the regime is, and its relations with the West, but also with Russia, and what the future holds for Iran.
So, Dr. Aniseh Bassiri Tabrizi, you're the Senior Research Fellow at the Royal United Services Institute and the lead on Middle Eastern Studies, and we're going to talk about Iran. We've seen these widespread protests in Iran ever since the death of Mahsa Amini in police custody. She was arrested by the morality police for allegedly wearing her headscarf incorrectly. And these protests have been going on for months now. Is that simply because they aren't just about the wearing of the hijab? They have become something much more than that, an actual direct calling for change to the regime?
Well, first of all, thanks for having me. And I think obviously this is an interesting topic to discuss. As you say, that these protests have been going on for a while. At the beginning, it seemed to be possible that they could stop quite quickly because of the repression by the regime, but here we are still talking about them 4 months in. And I think the reason for them to continue is definitely the fact that there is a number of factors that lead to unhappiness with the status quo within Iran. In this case, the protests have started because of what happened to Mahsa Amini and the repression and the restriction on the hijab. But we know that other demonstrations took place in recent years for different reasons, very different reasons. Economics, the situation of workers and other limitations, both in political and civil terms. But at the same time, there is also the awareness that the demonstrations in itself, however powerful they are in the messaging, are not enough to lead to any change, unfortunately.
Because as you say, there were protests in 2009, protests in 2017, but they weren't as widespread as these ones, correct? As in, we've seen protests in all of the provinces of Iran.
I think, especially the 2009, they were widespread as well, but they were for a very different reason. They were very specifically linked to the outcome of the 2009 presidential election and the contested vote and results of them. 2017, you correctly mentioned them, and also the 2019 one, they were quite widespread as well. I think in terms of how diverse they are in the amount of places that they cover, they're quite all widespread. But I think this is significant because of the involvement of women and the resilience that they have shown to the demonstration, repression by the regime, but also the involvement of different classes and different kind of people within the demonstration, not just for one reason, as you say, not just the hijab reason, but general, I would say, unhappiness with the status quo.
And is it classes, all classes, as well as all ethnicities as well within Iran?
There is definitely a broader spread in terms of the ethnicity and the groups of people who have been involved. We know that the Kurds, for instance, have been heavily involved because Mahsa Amini was herself Kurd, so we know that that component has been part of it. But I wouldn't really talk about this demonstration as ethnically driven. I think what is interesting about them is the amount of inclusivity and how many people have resonated with the grievances that have been brought up by the people in the demonstrations.
And by inclusivity, do you mean the sense that this is women complaining about conservative laws? It's farmers complaining about a lack of water, students about a lack of freedom. Is that what you mean by it's very much all of these different groups, but everyone together?
Well, everyone together, not really, because I think that these demonstrations are still very divided.
Really?
I think
so it's not united?
No, I don't think so. I think there is still a lack of united demands. There have been obviously anti-regime slogans, anti-regime chants, but there is no unity still in what is that the people want. Each group would say, for instance, hijab laws need to be changed, or the morality police needs to be withdrawn, and workers would have their own demands. But there isn't really a united sense of what it is that needs to be changed. And I think this is one side of the weakness. There is no leaders as such. There is a lot of people involvement. There is a lot of inclusivity, as we said, but not really a kind of movement, social movement as such, that could lead to a more massive involvement.
Is that not also, though, turning over to look the other way, also part of its sustainability, the fact that it has no clear leaders? That therefore means that the regime has no, there's no individual it can sort of put down, arrest, whatever. It springs up wherever in different neighborhoods.
Yeah, to some extent, I think you're right. I think, the fact that there are more people involved and there is no top person that can be responsible or accountable for it, it's possibly one of the strengths in terms of how much targeted it can be by the regime. But we are seeing also the success of the regime in curtailing the demonstrations. We have seen that they have diminished over the past few weeks. And part of it, even without leaders, is their ability to target those involved in it with execution, with strong repression, being also arrests and basically condemnation of all those involved. And I think this in itself is a deterrent for those who have been involved in the demonstration, even if there is no leader and even if not just 1 to 10 people have been targeted for it.
Because when the demonstrations first began in September following Mahsa Amini's death, there was, you still saw the videos on social media of people being shot at in the street, individuals coming around, banging on people's doors, arresting people. Can you just detail in terms of the crackdown where it is now? Because if you're saying that the protests are slowly diminishing, does that mean that the crackdown has intensified and those executions have increased?
We have seen over the past few months that the regime has been more heavily involved in the execution of those who have been responsible for killing police force members. But we have also seen that the continuation of the repression by the regime in terms of the crackdown, the arrests, and condemnation of the demonstration, that doesn't necessarily mean that the grievances have diminished or that the drive by the population to be involved in the demonstration is diminished. But I think I would say the willingness to take the risk to go into the street has definitely diminished over the past few months. I think that's a sign that the repression is somewhat working and that the intention of the people to go into the street for the time being, at least, has been contained to a certain extent. But that doesn't mean that, a few months down the line, there won't be another trigger, another demonstration, another reason for people to showcase their grievances and, even gather in a much larger scale, possibly.
And in terms of the status quo and what might happen down the line, I mean, one thing to look at is the economy, obviously, because as you've been saying,
Yes.
These protests aren't just about one particular issue. It also involves issues like the economy. And in Iran right now, the cost of living is soaring. The value of the currency has crashed. Inflation is high. How bad is it right now, the economic picture in Iran? And how bad could that get down the line and propel these protests further?
Well, we know that some of the previous demonstrations we touched on before have been driven by the state of the economy. So that wouldn't be anything new. We have seen that the state of the economy has been bad in Iran for several years, I would say at least since 2017 continuously, but even more so, as you say, now with the growing inflation. Post-COVID, obviously, COVID has hit, internationally in all the countries, but Iran even more so. We know that sanctions are a big part of how the country has been suffering, how much has been suffering, economically speaking. I think there is not yet a certainty about how sustainable the Iranian economy is and how long it can continue, basically maintaining a current stability, given the situation, the pressure that it is under. So I wouldn't be surprised if it happens again. And instead of being Mahsa Amini, the driver of demonstration is, lack of employment or a specific situation with specific workers, say in the oil sector or any other specific sector as well.
And how key, you mentioned and touched upon sanctions there, how key is that intervention from the West in terms of, ever since Donald Trump left the nuclear deal and imposed harsh sanctions in 2018, the US, the UK, and the EU imposed fresh sanctions this week. Are those really having an impact now?
There are sanctions and sanctions. Some sanctions have a very strong impact on the Iranian economy, and some sanctions are mainly symbolic and messaging, right? When we target, like those responsible for the crackdown, for instance, that doesn't necessarily have an impact on the state of the Iranian economy. When we are talking on sanctions on the oil sector, the energy sector, on any other economic sector, those have a strong impact on the Iranian economy.
And what do you think in terms of the sanctions which have been imposed now and before? Do you think there's a Western mindset here that is thinking having the economic sanctions are a way of putting pressure on the regime that there could be regime change down the line?
I think some of the sanctions are led by that kind of thinking. So I wouldn't exclude it. Some of the sanctions are intended to send a symbol, send a signal that this is not acceptable. This is not something that the West can accept. When we are talking about human rights violation, when we are talking about repression, this is mainly the case because we are talking about frozen assets and bans on travel. So these are mainly symbolic. They don't really have a repercussion on the Iranian economy. But when we are talking about sectoral sanction, the imposition of sanction on specific sector and specific fields within the economy, those actually have a strong impact on the economy. And, some might be also thinking that that could help in terms of change. And, but the problem is that really sanctions in most cases affect the whole population.
Is another downside, I guess, to the sanctions is that we've seen, Iran get more and more isolated, obviously, on the international stage, especially with the protests and the West speaking out in favor of the protests and against the regime's crackdown. We have seen Iran grow closer to Russia, supplying drones for Russia in its war on Ukraine after invading Ukraine in February last year. What's going on there?
Well, the Russia-Iran relation is a complicated one. Obviously, it's something that the two countries have been having for a long time. It's not something that they established only since last February, since the war in Ukraine. Look at Syria, for instance. Iran and Russia have been working in Syria very closely on the same side of the war since the very beginning, and even more so since 2015. There are other fields in which they have been working together, Afghanistan, for instance, just to name one. So this collaboration is nothing new. I think the scale in which they are collaborating is new, but I think it doesn't have to do with the domestic situation. Again, it started before the demonstrations were taking place. I think it started with, obviously, the new administration. We know there has been a new president since June 2021, and that has led to a significant change in Iran's foreign policy. There has been a drive by this administration to look east more significantly, more consistently, and Russia has been a favored partner in that sense. And we know that with the prioritization of looking east, there is a deprioritization of looking west, namely with negotiation on the nuclear issue, generally speaking, relations with Western countries, also the US and Europe in particular. So when, the priority is not to have the negotiation with the West, is not to have more economic and political ties with the West, the other thing happens, which is stronger relations with the East, including with Russia, but also China and other regional partners. So I think that is, the mentality and the drive by the current administration. Obviously, the failure of, the negotiation on the nuclear issue, but also the more global context of the war, and I would say the anti-Western axis that is shaping, particularly between Russia, China, and Iran, has led to a stronger emphasis on this axis and on these relations from Tehran's side as well.
Let's talk about the Iran nuclear deal and why it was set up. In 2015, an agreement was reached between Iran and the United Nations Security Council's 5 permanent members: the United States, France, the UK, China, and Russia, plus Germany. It was essentially aimed at restricting Iran's development of nuclear weapons, and in exchange, international relations against Iran would be dropped. But then in 2018, former President Donald Trump decided to withdraw the US from the deal.
We cannot prevent an Iranian nuclear bomb under the decaying and rotten structure of the current agreement.
Now, Joe Biden has made reviving the nuclear deal one of the US's top foreign policy priorities. But in December 2022, the president was overheard saying he believes the nuclear deal is dead. So where does it really stand now, and is there any chance of it being revived?
So the goal by the Biden administration initially was to restore the relation on the JCPOA, the so-called Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, and basically bring both parties completely into compliance. And that has been the goal when the two sides were meeting indirectly in Vienna for several months. But we know that since the summer, so August, September 2022, we have seen no progress whatsoever on the negotiation. There was a final draft that didn't lead anywhere.
Why is that?
I think, again, lots of details, which might be a lot of technicalities, but the requests that Iran made were not met by a response, a positive response by the US. They were considered as unreasonable and beyond the scope of the JCPOA, of the nuclear deal. Plus, we have seen a worsening of the international situation with, the Iranian support, as you mentioned, for Russia in the war in Ukraine.
And there's now talk, the European Parliament and others want to call the Iranian Revolutionary Guard. They want to, declare that a terrorist, designated a terrorist organization, which is a red line, isn't it, for Iran?
I don't know if it's a red line. I think obviously it would be met with a response,
But would that end any talk of a negotiation?
There is no talks at the moment in the negotiation. I think, the bottom line is that it's not linked to the designation of the Revolutionary Guards. It's linked to the fact that these demonstrations are happening and they are repressed by the Iranian regime. Plus, Iran is supplying Russia with drones. So I would say the appeal of returning to negotiation by the West is not as much as it was in the summer. And we know that because of Iran rejection of the draft that it was presented then, and basically no constructive suggestion since then, there is very, very little hope that a restoration of the talks could happen at all.
As well as the fact that Iran executed Ali Reza Akbari, the former deputy Iranian defense minister. He was British-Iranian, accused of spying for the UK in 2019. He was recently executed. Given that he was in prison for all those years, why did that execution take place when it did? What was the thinking in Tehran?
Well, it's hard to know what the thinking was. I think it was definitely a signal to the West, in particular the UK, about what Iran is willing and able to do, no matter what the pressure, what the criticism, even in the field of human rights and repression. But I think it's also something that has to do with the domestic, infighting, power play, even within the conservative faction. So I think there is a lot behind that, but it doesn't have necessarily to do with what is going on the nuclear issue, and possibly not even linked to Iran-US or Iran-West relation as such. I think has a lot to do with UK-Iran relation, which are not at a great state at the moment for a different reason. But it has also to do with the domestic infighting between different parts of the institutions as well.
If negotiations have been, dead for a while and they look like they're never going to be renewed anytime soon, is the thinking, do you think, perhaps from Western nations, one of the many reasons to not get involved in negotiations is that this regime is at its weakest point ever? Is it arguably at its weakest point ever? And there may be no point trying to negotiate with this regime because who knows how long it may last?
I think there are different reasons for which maybe, the West might think that it's not a good time to talk. And I think, one of them is definitely what Iran is doing with Russia. I think that it was a game changer, to be honest. Demonstrations were important. Obviously, countries in the West were looking and are looking and condemning and, taking action in terms of sanctions when it comes to those involved in it. But I think the game changer has been really the provision of drones and, the scale to which Iran has become a direct threat to Europe and its interests on the ground, besides of being a threat in the region and therefore indirectly to European allies and US allies. I think that really changed the calculation. But I think
Does that mean you would say that the sanctions from the West are more about stopping the flow of weapons to Russia than they are about trying to bring the regime to its knees?
Well, I think the two are linked together, right? So some of them are going to be directed towards one goal and some others indirectly on the other. It doesn't necessarily mean that they are going to achieve that goal. I mean, we can talk about success of sanctions as much as you want. But I think, again, there are several intentions there. But my question is whether, cutting off diplomacy is really a strategy that works off. I know that it's normal to look at, engagement with Iran in the current state as challenging, problematic, toxic, if you wish. But I think cutting out any kind of opportunity for diplomacy, even talking about withdrawal of ambassadors and the diplomatic representative for Tehran, might be dangerous, because then the route to escalation, the route for having more of a possibility, if you wish, of confrontation and war, increases rather than decreases.
Let's just quickly summarize and familiarize yourselves with Iran's political system since the foundation of the Islamic Republic. Following that revolution in 1979, Iran got rid of its monarchy under the Shah and it became an Islamic Republic. It's a theocracy, meaning its laws are based on religion, and in this case, the Shia concept of Islam. The supreme leader has the most power in the system, and that's currently Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, who has been in that position since 1989. But there's also an elected president who at times in the Republic's history has been a reformist. But in the 2020 election, many candidates were disqualified from contesting the presidency, and turnout was the lowest in the Republic's history. The new president, Ibrahim Raisi, was elected and is an ultra-conservative. Critics say he lacks his own agenda and that he's too close a confidant of the supreme leader. So could these widespread protests spark a change to a system that has become so entrenched in its viewpoint? Since the protests, we have seen, I guess you would call them, reformists, moderates, speaking in favor of the protests. The former president, Mohammed Khatami, he said that he praised the protests. A former speaker of the parliament said that we must provide the public venues for protests. Does that show that amongst the elites within Iran, there is a desire for reform, moderation?
In brief, I think we are in a situation in which there are those who are in a leadership position, but outside the current centers of power, who recognize some sort of reform, change would be needed. But I think, again, they are not in the center of power. I think those in power believe that they have the upper hand. They believe that they are completely in control of the regime, and that there is no cracks or there is no issue that they cannot deal with, including the demonstration. I think they feel like they can contain them and that they are in a position of power to deal with the current situation. So when you talk about is the regime at its weakest point, is the Islamic Republic at its weakest point, depends who you ask, and depends on from what point of view. I think in terms of legitimacy, erosion of the legitimacy and the relations between the people and the government, the regime, I think that's probably right. I think there is a very high level of erosion of the legitimacy of the Islamic Republic. There is a significant gap between those in power and those who are not in power. And that is growing, that gap is growing exponentially. But in terms of how strong the regime it is in terms of hard power, ability to maintain its control and its government, I think that is still very, very strong.
And so I guess my final question is, how much should we look to if there won't be a regime change soon? The fact that Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, his health is often talked about. He is an elderly man. He has been the supreme leader since 1989. Would his death be the point where there may be either a large-scale protest which calls for massive change, or a movement within those upper echelons of the regime to actually try and address the concerns of the people?
I think it's a very good question. I think nobody knows what will happen then. I think there is potential for that to be a catalytic moment of change. We have seen, for instance, even between the death of Khomeini and Khamenei, there has been a tremendous amount of change, even if that did not mean regime change. I think a lot of what will happen when Khamenei dies depends on what will happen before then. So, like what happens between now and then in terms of the strengthening, say, of the Revolutionary Guards and the weakening of the clerics, as we talk about the legitimacy gap. what happens in that front, what happens in terms of the security of the current regime and its confrontation with the US on one side, but regional countries on the other side, Israel, Saudi Arabia on the other front. I think there is so much that is still a question mark, that it's very difficult to know to what extent the death of Khamenei will be a turning point. But the fact that that is a very big deal is a fact, is nothing that can be discussed. And I think a lot of what is happening right now in terms of political infight, even within the hardliners and the same factions as well, has to do with the fact that there is awareness that a big transition point is in the making.
Dr. Aniseh Bassiri Tabrizi, thank you very much for joining me. Thank you.
Thank you.